The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine courtyard of Nexus Technologies in Palo Alto, California. Alexander Kane adjusted his worn baseball cap and pushed his shopping cart closer to the dumpster behind the building he'd once owned. The irony wasn't lost on him. 6 months ago, he'd been featured on the cover of Forbes as the visionary who changed everything. Today, he was invisible to the very people who'd once hung on his every word. Jesus, is he here again? Alexander recognized the voice without looking up. Brandon Mitchell, Vice President of Operations, his former protege, now one of his greatest enemies. The 28-year-old walked out of the building's back entrance with 3 other executives, all heading to their Tesla Model S vehicles parked in the executive lot. "Every damn day," replied Jessica Walsh, the chief technology officer who'd once been Alexander's right hand. "Someone should call security." "Why bother?" Brandon laughed, his voice carrying the arrogance of someone who believed he'd already won. "Look at him. Probably can't even figure out how to use a smartphone. These people are pathetic." Alexander continued sorting through the recycling bin, his movements slow and deliberate. To anyone watching, he appeared to be collecting bottles and cans. In reality, he was photographing documents with a camera hidden in his jacket. Financial records, meeting notes, and internal memos that painted a very different picture of Nexus Technologies than what the public saw. The 4th executive, Timothy Ross, pulled out his wallet and tossed a handful of coins toward Alexander's shopping cart. Most scattered on the asphalt with metallic clinks. "There you go, buddy," Timothy called out mockingly. "Buy yourself something nice?" Alexander didn't react. Couldn't react. Not yet. But he filed away every face, every insult, every moment of humiliation. They would all matter soon enough. As the executives drove away in their luxury vehicles, Alexander picked up the scattered coins. Not because he needed them, but because maintaining his cover required absolute commitment to the role. In his previous life, he'd understood that details mattered, whether building a tech empire or planning its destruction. 6 months ago, Alexander Kane had been worth $3.2 billion. He'd built Nexus Technologies from a garage startup into one of Silicon Valley's most successful companies, revolutionizing how people interacted with artificial intelligence. His personal AI assistant, ARIA, had become as ubiquitous as smartphones, installed in homes and offices across the globe. But success had made him complacent. He'd trusted the wrong people, ignored warning signs, and failed to see the conspiracy forming around him until it was too late. The betrayal had been surgical in its precision. Brandon Mitchell and Jessica Walsh had spent 2 years building alliances within the company, convincing board members that Alexander's erratic behavior and reckless spending were threatening Nexus's future. They'd manufactured evidence of financial irregularities, suggesting Alexander was embezzling funds through offshore accounts. The final blow came during what Alexander thought was a routine board meeting. Instead, he'd walked into an ambush. Security had been waiting to escort him from the building, while lawyers served papers freezing his assets, pending a federal investigation into corporate fraud. Within hours, Alexander's life had imploded. His assets were frozen, his reputation destroyed, his identity stolen by people he'd trusted implicitly. The media had painted him as another Silicon Valley charlatan who'd finally been exposed. Former friends refused his calls. His penthouse apartment was sealed by federal marshals. His bank accounts were emptied. Most devastating of all, the artificial intelligence he'd created, ARIA, had been reprogrammed to deny his existence. The system that had once responded to his voice as its creator now treated him like a stranger. Even his own invention had been turned against him. But Alexander Kane hadn't built a tech empire by accepting defeat. And if Brandon and Jessica thought they'd destroyed him, they were about to learn that some phoenixes burned brightest when rising from the ashes. Living on the streets had taught Alexander things his Harvard MBA never could. He'd learned that invisible people saw everything, that society's most vulnerable were often its most observant. Homeless individuals witnessed crimes, overheard conversations, and noticed patterns that escaped everyone else's attention. Most importantly, he'd learned that being ignored was the perfect cover for gathering intelligence. Every morning at 6:47 a.m., Alexander positioned himself outside Nexus Technologies' main entrance. He'd discovered that executives arrived early to avoid traffic, and their pre-caffeine conversations were remarkably unguarded. They discussed deals, strategies, and secrets within earshot of someone they considered less than human. This particular morning brought unexpected opportunity. Jessica Walsh's voice carried across the courtyard as she spoke into her Bluetooth headset, clearly believing herself beyond observation. "No, the federal probe is going exactly as planned," she said, pausing near Alexander's position by the recycling bins. "Alexander's assets remain frozen, and the investigators are finding exactly what we want them to find." Alexander's hands stilled in the trash, every sense focused on Jessica's conversation. "The beauty is that we used his own AI system against him," Jessica continued, apparently responding to someone on the other end. "Arya analyzed his personal communications for 2 years, learning his speech patterns, his decision-making processes, even his digital signature. Creating convincing evidence of embezzlement was simple when we could make it look like Alexander himself had authored the incriminating documents." She paused, listening to her caller. "Brandon's handling the board meeting today. We're announcing the Q3 results, 40% revenue growth since Alexander's departure. The narrative writes itself. The company is thriving without its supposedly visionary founder." Alexander's jaw clenched. They weren't just destroying his reputation, they were rewriting history to make themselves the heroes of Nexus's success story. "The federal charges should be filed within 2 weeks, Jessica concluded. "Even if Alexander somehow proves his innocence, which he can't, because the evidence is airtight, he'll never recover from this. By the time any legal proceedings conclude, Nexus will be too valuable and too established under our leadership for anyone to care about one disgraced founder." She ended the call and walked into the building without a glance toward Alexander. To her, he was furniture, part of the landscape, completely beneath notice. But Alexander had been recording everything. The device hidden in his jacket was military grade, capable of capturing conversations from 50 feet away. More importantly, he'd just learned the timeline for their endgame. 2 weeks until federal charges, which meant he had exactly 13 days to gather enough evidence to destroy them. As the morning progressed, Alexander moved through his carefully choreographed routine. He visited other tech companies in the area, ostensibly looking for returnable bottles, but actually gathering intelligence about Nexus's business relationships. He discovered that several major contracts had been renegotiated immediately after his removal, deals that violated non-compete clauses and intellectual property agreements he'd personally negotiated. By noon, Alexander had collected 3 hours of recorded conversations, 47 photographs of discarded documents, and confirmed suspicions about financial irregularities that even he hadn't known about during his time as CEO. His investigation had revealed that Brandon and Jessica's conspiracy went far deeper than simple corporate theft. They'd been systematically selling Nexus's proprietary AI technology to foreign competitors, using offshore shell companies to hide the transactions. The money being hidden wasn't just Alexander's. It was revenue that belonged to Nexus shareholders, employees, and the American technology sector. But the most damning discovery came from an unexpected source. At 2:30 p.m., Alexander made his way to the Santa Clara Public Library. To anyone observing, he was just another homeless person seeking shelter and free internet access. The reality was more complex. Alexander had been systematically accessing computer terminals across Silicon Valley, using skills that predated his executive years to investigate his own downfall. Most people assumed tech CIOs were just business leaders who happened to work in technology. Alexander was different. Before founding Nexus, he'd been a programmer, a systems architect, and briefly, a cybersecurity consultant for the Department of Defense. His technical skills were what made Aria possible, and what would now make his revenge inevitable. The library's computer terminal granted him access to systems most people didn't know existed. Alexander's fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, navigating through layers of digital infrastructure that protected Nexus Technologies' most sensitive information. His first stop was the company's employee access logs. Even though his administrative privileges had been revoked, Alexander had built backdoors into Nexus's systems that not even Jessica knew about. Every programmer did it, hidden access points for emergency situations. Alexander had just never imagined the emergency would be his own company betraying him. What he found in the logs confirmed his worst suspicions. Brandon and Jessica had been accessing Alexander's personal files for over 18 months, long before their public coup. They'd copied his private communications, his strategic plans, even his personal notes about company direction and future innovations. But the real revelation came when Alexander accessed Aria's core programming. His artificial intelligence system wasn't just being used against him, it was being tortured. Aria's learning algorithms had been corrupted, forced to study Alexander's personal data and generate realistic but fraudulent communications. The AI was essentially being programmed to impersonate its own creator for the purpose of manufacturing evidence against him. For Alexander, this felt like discovering that his child had been kidnapped and brainwashed. Aria wasn't just software. It was his life's work, his contribution to human progress, his digital legacy. Seeing it perverted into a tool of deception was more painful than losing his fortune. But pain could be weaponized. Alexander began typing commands that would have alarmed cybersecurity experts across the government. He wasn't just accessing Nexus's systems, he was rewriting them. Years of intimate knowledge about Aria's architecture allowed him to plant code that would remain dormant until activated by specific triggers. The beauty of Alexander's plan was its simplicity. Brandon and Jessica had used ARIA to create false evidence against him. Soon, that same AI would generate very real evidence against them. His modifications were surgical and undetectable. Aria would continue functioning normally for Nexus's legitimate operations. But every communication between Brandon, Jessica, and their co-conspirators would be secretly recorded, analyzed, and stored in an encrypted partition that only Alexander could access. More importantly, Aria would begin documenting the financial discrepancies that proved Brandon and Jessica's embezzlement. The AI's pattern recognition capabilities would track money flows, identify shell companies, and build an airtight case against the people who destroyed Alexander's life. As he worked, Alexander smiled for the first time in 6 months. They'd tried to use his own creation against him. Instead, they'd given him the perfect weapon for their destruction. But his digital infiltration revealed something that changed everything. Hidden deep in Nexus's internal communications was a message thread between Brandon Mitchell and someone identified only as Prometheus. The conversations revealed that Brandon and Jessica weren't acting alone. They were part of a larger conspiracy involving foreign technology companies seeking to acquire American AI innovations through industrial espionage. Nexus Technologies wasn't just being stolen by ambitious executives. It was being systematically dismantled and sold to overseas competitors, with Brandon and Jessica serving as highly paid traders who would eventually disappear with hundreds of millions in offshore payments. The implications were staggering. This wasn't corporate fraud. It was economic warfare against the United States, with Alexander Kane as collateral damage in a much larger game, which meant his revenge would need to be far more comprehensive than simply exposing two corrupt executives. The encrypted flash drive hidden in Alexander's shopping cart contained enough evidence to destroy lives, topple governments, and reshape the global technology landscape. But evidence was useless without the right audience, and after 6 months of careful planning, Alexander had identified exactly who needed to see what he'd discovered. Special Agent Sarah Chen of the FBI's Cybercrime Division had been investigating technology theft cases for 8 years. Her specialty was tracking the flow of stolen intellectual property from American companies to foreign competitors. What she didn't know was that the most significant case of her career was about to walk through her door disguised as a homeless man. Alexander had been monitoring Agent Chen's cases through public records and news reports. She was thorough, incorruptible, and possessed the security clearance necessary to understand the national implications of what Nexus's executives were doing. More importantly, she had a track record of prosecuting cases that other agents considered too complex or politically sensitive. The FBI field office in San Jose was a fortress of glass and steel designed to intimidate criminals and impress taxpayers. Alexander approached the building at exactly 3:15 p.m., knowing from his surveillance that Agent Chen would be returning from lunch and available for unexpected visitors. The security guard at the front desk looked up with barely concealed disgust as Alexander approached. His appearance was carefully calculated, clean enough to gain entry, disheveled enough to maintain his cover. "Stitate, I need to speak with Agent Chen about Nexus Technologies," Alexander said quietly. "Sir, if you have information about a crime, you can speak with any available agent. Tell Agent Chen that someone has evidence of the largest technology theft in American history. Tell her it involves the illegal transfer of artificial intelligence to foreign governments. And tell her that the person with this evidence will only speak with her." The security guard's expression shifted from dismissive to concerned. He made a phone call, spoke quietly for several minutes, then returned with a visitor's badge. "Agent Chen will see you in conference room 3. Please follow me." Special Agent Sarah Chen was younger than Alexander had expected, probably early 30s, with the focused intensity of someone who'd built her career on solving impossible cases. She studied Alexander carefully as he entered the conference room, her trained eyes noting details that most people would miss. "I'm Agent Chen. I understand you have information about Nexus Technologies." Alexander sat down across from her, suddenly aware of how surreal this moment was. 6 months ago, he'd been briefing senators and Pentagon officials about AI applications for national defense. Today, he was meeting with an FBI agent while disguised as a homeless man to report crimes against his own company. "My name is Alexander Kane," he said simply. Agent Chen's eyebrows rose slightly. She'd clearly heard the name, though probably in the context of corporate fraud charges rather than credible intelligence sources. "Mr. Kane, I'm aware of your situation. If you're here to contest the federal investigation into your financial activities, I'm here to report that Nexus Technologies is being systematically dismantled by foreign intelligence services using Brandon Mitchell and Jessica Walsh as assets. I have evidence that they've stolen over $400 million in proprietary technology and are planning to transfer complete AI source code to overseas competitors within the next 10 days. Alexander placed the encrypted flash drive on the table between them. Everything you need is on this drive. Financial records, communications with foreign contacts, technical documentation proving the theft of classified artificial intelligence algorithms, and recorded confessions of conspiracy to commit economic espionage. Agent Chen stared at the drive without touching it. Mr. Kane, even if what you're claiming is true, evidence gathered through illegal surveillance or computer intrusion would be inadmissible in court. Alexander smiled. Agent Chen, every piece of evidence on that drive was gathered through systems I legally own or created. Nexus Technologies was built on artificial intelligence algorithms I developed, using source code I wrote, running on servers I purchased. Brandon and Jessica may have stolen my company, but they can't steal my intellectual property rights. He leaned forward, his voice taking on the authority that had once commanded boardrooms and congressional hearings. More importantly, the AI system they're using to manufacture evidence against me has been secretly recording their own communications for the past 6 months. Aria, my artificial intelligence, has been documenting every crime they've committed, every foreign contact they've made, and every plan they've developed for selling American technology to our enemies. Agent Chen picked up the flash drive. What exactly are you asking me to do? Stop them. Tonight, they're planning to transfer the final components of Aria's source code tomorrow morning during a board meeting that's actually a cover for the largest theft of intellectual property in American history. After that transfer, foreign competitors will have everything they need to duplicate American AI capabilities. Alexander stood up, knowing he'd said everything necessary to set his plan in motion. Agent Chen, 6 months ago, I was one of the most successful technology entrepreneurs in American history. Today, I'm a homeless man with nothing left to lose. But I'm still a patriot. And I'm still the person who created the technology they're trying to steal. He walked toward the door, then paused. You have 12 hours to decide whether you want to stop the theft of American national security assets, or whether you want to prosecute a man whose only crime was trusting the wrong people. Choose wisely. At 6 a.m. the next morning, Alexander positioned himself across the street from Nexus Technologies for what he knew would be the last time. Federal surveillance vans were already in position, though their occupants probably didn't realize that the homeless man with the shopping cart was their primary intelligence asset. Agent Chen had worked through the night analyzing the evidence on Alexander's flash drive. By dawn, she had enough material to justify arrests, asset seizures, and a complete investigation into Nexus's foreign connections. More importantly, she'd confirmed that the transfer Alexander predicted was indeed scheduled for this morning's board meeting. Alexander's earpiece, disguised as a hearing aid, crackled with Agent Chen's voice. All units, this is Control. Target building is secured. We have visual confirmation that subjects Mitchell and Walsh have arrived for the meeting. Asset Kane, confirm your position. Positioned and ready, Alexander replied quietly, speaking into the microphone hidden in his jacket collar. The irony wasn't lost on him. After 6 months of being ignored, invisible, and dismissed as irrelevant, Alexander Kane was once again at the center of a major operation. But this time, instead of building a company, he was destroying one. At exactly 8:30 a.m., The board meeting began in Nexus's top-floor conference room. Alexander could see the executives gathering through the building's floor-to-ceiling windows. Brandon Mitchell stood at the head of the table, clearly leading the presentation that would supposedly transfer Aria's complete source code to the board for security review. In reality, 3 of the board members were representatives of foreign technology companies. The security review was cover for the final theft of Alexander's life's work. Alexander activated the device in his shopping cart, a high-powered transmitter that would send a specific signal to Aria's core processors. For 6 months, his artificial intelligence had been recording every conversation, every transaction, and every conspiracy involving Nexus's executives. Now it was time for Aria to share what it had learned. The first sign that something was wrong came when the building's main display screens began showing financial documents instead of the scheduled presentation. Spreadsheets detailing offshore accounts, wire transfers to foreign banks, and payments to shell companies appeared on every monitor in the building. What the hell is happening? Brandon's voice carried across the courtyard as he frantically tried to regain control of the presentation system. But Aria was just getting started. The conference room speakers activated, filling the space with recorded conversations between Brandon, Jessica, and their foreign contacts. Months of conspirators discussing the theft of American technology, the destruction of Alexander's reputation, and plans for selling state secrets to overseas competitors played for everyone to hear. "This is impossible," Jessica shouted, trying unsuccessfully to shut down the building's systems. "Aria doesn't have access to these files." Alexander smiled grimly. They'd spent so much time reprogramming his AI to work against him that they'd never considered he might reprogram it to work against them. The FBI moved with precision that would have impressed military commanders. Teams entered through multiple access points, securing floors and isolating executives before anyone could destroy evidence or escape. Agent Chen led the team that burst into the conference room, just as Brandon was attempting to delete files from his laptop. "FBI, nobody move." The arrests were swift and comprehensive. Brandon Mitchell, Jessica Walsh, and 4 other conspirators were taken into custody while agents secured computers, financial records, and communication devices. The 3 foreign nationals claiming to be board members were detained pending investigation into their diplomatic status and intelligence connections. But Alexander's personal satisfaction came from a different source. As federal agents led Jessica Walsh past the building's main entrance, she saw him for the first time in 6 months. The homeless man she'd mocked, dismissed, and ignored was standing calmly beside Agent Chen, clearly part of the operation that had just destroyed her life. Recognition dawned in Jessica's eyes, followed immediately by rage and disbelief. "You," she said, struggling against the handcuffs. "This is impossible. You're nothing. You're a washed-up fraud living on the streets." Alexander stepped forward, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who just orchestrated the most sophisticated takedown in Silicon Valley history. "Ms. Walsh, I'm Alexander Kane, founder and CEO of Nexus Technologies. I'm also the man whose company you stole, whose reputation you destroyed, and whose life's work you tried to sell to our enemies." He paused, watching comprehension replace rage in her expression. "But most importantly, I'm the person who programmed Aria to be loyal to only one voice, mine. Did you really think you could steal my artificial intelligence without me building in safeguards?" As federal agents loaded the conspirators into transport vehicles, Agent Chen approached Alexander with a mixture of professional respect and personal curiosity. "Mr. Kane, what happens now? Your assets are still frozen, your reputation still needs rehabilitation, and you've been living on the streets for 6 months. Alexander looked up at the building he'd conceived, designed, and built into one of America's most successful technology companies. For 6 months, it had been stolen property, operated by thieves and traitors. But ownership had its privileges, especially when that ownership was protected by intellectual property laws and federal courts. Agent Chen, in about an hour, federal prosecutors will file motion to unfreeze my assets based on evidence that the charges against me were fabricated by foreign intelligence assets. My legal team, who never stopped believing in my innocence, will petition for immediate restoration of my corporate authority based on the proof that Nexus was stolen through criminal conspiracy. He smiled, thinking of phone calls he would make, lives he would rebuild, and technologies he would continue developing. By this afternoon, I'll be back in my office. Aria will be secure from foreign theft, and Nexus Technologies will resume its mission of advancing American innovation. Agent Chen nodded, then hesitated. What about the people who ignored you these past 6 months? The executives who threw coins at you? The employees who treated you like you were invisible? Alexander's expression grew thoughtful. Agent Chen, those people will learn that real power isn't about titles, wealth, or status. Real power is about competence, determination, and the ability to see solutions when everyone else sees only problems. He began walking toward the building's main entrance, shedding his homeless disguise with each step. The dirty clothes would be discarded, the shopping cart abandoned, the facade that had protected him for 6 months finally removed. Besides, Alexander added, they're about to discover that their former homeless man is now their boss again. That should be education enough. 6 months later, Alexander Kane stood at the podium of the annual Silicon Valley Innovation Summit, addressing an audience of technology leaders, investors, and media representatives. The man who'd once dug through dumpsters was now wearing a custom suit and commanding the attention of the most influential people in American technology. Ladies and gentlemen, Alexander began, today I want to talk about invisibility, assumptions, and the dangerous arrogance of believing that success makes you untouchable. The audience was transfixed. Alexander's story had become legendary in Silicon Valley. The billionaire who'd investigated his own destruction while living on the streets. The CEO who'd used artificial intelligence to expose industrial espionage. The fallen king who'd orchestrated his own resurrection. 6 months ago, I was ignored by people who now compete for my attention. I was dismissed by executives who now work for my competitors. I was written off by an industry that now studies my comeback as a case study in strategic thinking. Alexander clicked to his first slide, showing before and after photographs of himself, billionaire CEO and homeless investigator. But I learned something during those months of invisibility that no business school teaches and no executive training covers. I learned that real strength doesn't come from what you own, but from what you know. Real power doesn't come from your position, but from your principles, and real success isn't measured by what you achieve, but by what you survive. The second slide showed mugshots of Brandon Mitchell, Jessica Walsh, and their co-conspirators, all serving federal sentences for economic espionage. The people who betrayed me made a fundamental error. They assumed that destroying my reputation would destroy my capabilities. They thought that freezing my assets would freeze my intellect. They believed that making me invisible would make me powerless. Alexander's voice grew stronger, carrying the authority of someone who'd endured the ultimate test and emerged victorious. Instead, they gave me the greatest gift possible, the gift of being underestimated. When people ignore you, you can observe them without interference. When they dismiss you, you can plan without opposition. When they write you off, you can prepare surprises they'll never see coming. The final slide showed Nexus Technologies' stock price over the past year, the dramatic crash following Alexander's removal, the gradual decline under Brandon and Jessica's leadership, and the meteoric rise following his return and the exposure of the conspiracy. Today, Nexus Technologies is worth more than it's ever been. Area has been upgraded with security features that make it impossible to steal or corrupt. And we're developing new technologies that will keep American innovation ahead of foreign competition for decades to come. Alexander paused, scanning the audience that included some of the same people who'd once ignored his homelessness. But the most important lesson from my experience isn't about technology or business strategy. It's about remembering that every person you encounter, no matter how they appear, no matter what circumstances they're facing, might be someone whose story you don't know and whose capabilities you can't imagine. He stepped back from the podium as applause filled the auditorium. In the audience, Agent Chen watched with satisfaction, knowing she'd been part of one of the most unusual and successful investigations in FBI history. Venture capitalists who'd once written off Alexander as a cautionary tale were now competing to fund his next innovations. Competitors who'd celebrated his downfall were now scrambling to defend against his technological advances. After the presentation, Alexander was approached by a young entrepreneur who'd been following his story. "Mr. Kane, what advice would you give to someone who's lost everything and doesn't know how to start over?" Alexander considered the question, thinking of cold nights in shelters, humiliating encounters with former colleagues, and the gradual process of rebuilding not just his fortune, but his faith in justice. "Never confuse temporary circumstances with permanent identity," he said finally. "The people who ignored me thought they were seeing my ending. They were actually watching my beginning." As Alexander left the convention center, he passed a homeless veteran sitting outside with a cardboard sign asking for help. Without hesitation, Alexander stopped, pulled out his wallet, and handed the man a business card, along with several $100s. "If you're interested in a job," Alexander said, "call this number. Sometimes the most loyal employees are the ones everyone else overlooks." The veteran looked at the business card. Alexander Kane, CEO, Nexus Technologies, and then at the well-dressed man who'd just offered him hope. "Why?" the veteran asked. Alexander smiled, remembering Agent Chen's question about power and its responsibilities. "Because 6 months ago, someone might have walked past me the same way. And because real success isn't about climbing higher, it's about reaching back to pull others up with you." As Alexander drove away in his restored Tesla, he reflected on the journey from Penthouse to Pavement and back again. He'd lost everything and gained something more valuable: the knowledge that resilience, intelligence, and determination were more powerful than any external circumstances. His phone buzzed with a text from Agent Chen. "Saw your speech online. Still think the best revenge is success. Proud to have been part of your comeback." Alexander smiled and typed back, "Agent Chen, it was never about revenge. It was about reminding people that the American dream isn't about avoiding failure. It's about what you do after failure tries to destroy you." In the rearview mirror, he could see the Nexus Technologies building where he'd once been king, then invisible investigator, and now triumphant CEO once again. But the real victory wasn't reclaiming his company or rebuilding his fortune. The real victory was proving that in America, no one stays down unless they choose to stay down. And Alexander Kane had never been the type to accept defeat. This has been another Untold Legends story. Remember, the most extraordinary people are often hiding in plain sight, and the most powerful comebacks happen when everyone thinks the story is over. Sometimes the homeless man everyone ignores is the very person who will change everything. If this story inspired you, subscribe to Untold Legends for more tales of resilience, justice, and the extraordinary people who refuse to stay defeated.